Welcome to the Yoga Nation, the Spirit of Gratitude podcast on the One Integration platform. Hello, friends. My name is Yogesh Patel, and this podcast focuses on bullying, self-awareness, and our inner spirit, inviting high-profile guests to share their experiences on these relevant topics. Today, my next guest is one of the most visible and trusted faces on broadcast news today. With his journalistic integrity, he has asked the very tough questions to presidents, world leaders, and politicians for the past 3 decades. He is Mr. Jonathan Karl, Chief Washington Correspondent for ABC News and co-host This Week with George Stephanopoulos. Jonathan, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Yogi, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And I'm not sure what to make of me asking you the tough questions now.
You're turning the tables on me, man. You're turning the tables on me. This is not typical.
Well, Jonathan, let's get started. You had mentioned that in your shout out that's referenced on the Yoga Nation website, that this gratitude podcast is just the discussion we need for our times. How do you mean?
Well, I mean, part of that was driven by the experience of meeting you and you telling me the story of your plans to start this podcast. We met out in Tucson, obviously, and you hadn't this podcast hadn't started. It was an idea for you at that point. And you have a sense of warmth and kindness about you, and a general, interest and care in humanity. I could just tell. I think the notion of a podcast that explores the issue of gratitude is needed now because we spend so much of our lives complaining or arguing or exploring that which divides us. I know, even in my own life, I've got so much to be grateful for that sometimes I need to, remind myself, focus on the things that you have to be grateful for.
So how do you practice gratitude?
I think a big part of it is letting the people in your life know. Don't take it for granted. Let your people in your life know how grateful you are that they are in your lives. The people you come across, not just your friends and family, but the people you come across in your daily interactions. Take a half a second and just, say thank you. And with a gesture, with a few words, let people know that you appreciate them.
That's interesting. Given the fact that you have, I would say the bully pulpit in journalism, what role does media, is there a role that media can do to help propagate this message that you just speak of?
I think it's how we live our lives. I don't know. My job is a very specific one. I'm there to gather information to try to get at the truth and try to keep people informed. And I'm not thinking of an agenda when I'm, doing my interviews or writing my stories, writing my books. I'm trying to tell a story and get an historic record down. So I'm primarily referring to how I handle my personal life, through my work, but mostly beyond my work.
That's interesting. And again, this podcast does focus on the inner spirit. And maybe if I could just shy away and ask you a question about the American spirit, and that is, you've covered or have been around 6 different presidents, I believe. What do they all have in common?
Well, I think that there's all for all there's a sense of the weight of history. I mean, when you think about it, Joe Biden is president 46. We've actually only had 45 because Grover Cleveland counts for 2 of those. And it's just not when you are a president of the United States, you're sitting in the Oval Office. The Oval Office obviously hasn't been there for all of that period. But John Adams is the first president to live in the White House. It's not that long ago. And there's a continuity and there's a sense of history and responsibility that I think to a certain degree weighs on every single one of them. And I think there's a sense of the predecessors and what came before.
I'm not quite sure I really understand your answer. Beyond just history, is there anything else that these men or these individuals, excuse me, share that have in common?
Well, they've all been men so far. They've all been men so far. I don't know. I mean, I think that having that awareness of their place in history affects each of them, maybe in different ways. I mean, presidents at the end of the day, it's about decisions. It's about leadership and leading the country, reassuring the country but it's decisions. I mean, that's ultimately what it is. I remember George W. Bush called himself, "I'm the decider. I'm the decider." And you need to kind of clear the debris away.
What are some of the key qualities that have helped you succeed to where you are today?
I think that maybe the most important quality of all is I love what I'm doing. I truly enjoy my job. Back to that sense of gratitude, I've never stopped feeling grateful that I had the opportunity to do what I do.
What about in situations where perhaps the interviewee tries to bully you and perhaps impose something to you that you are uncomfortable with?
Yeah, I mean, that certainly happens. But I remind myself that, I'm exactly where I want to be. And I don't let it bother me. I know that it's really not about me. They're not really trying to bully me, or they're trying to, take advantage of a situation. I represent something, and so look, I've been called names and had people attack me during the course of an interview or press conference. I have, by and large, it is not.
I guess it goes to the when I was a kid, sticks and stones may break my bones, but you'll never hurt me. Well, I'm curious. You mentioned you love what you do, but what role does luck play in your rise being one of the most trusted folks in news media today?
I mean, luck. You have to work very hard to be lucky. But luck is definitely a factor. And you get lucky breaks, but you have to be in a position to take advantage of those breaks, and you have to work very hard for those breaks to come your way. But it gets back to gratitude. I mean, I spent a good chunk of my time growing up out in a little town in South Dakota, where I moved when I was in 5th grade with my mom and my stepfather, and had like 350 people, and I lived on the outskirts of town. My mom and stepfather were working on a project about Mount Rushmore. This was in the Black Hills. And the first project was to go around and do a series of interviews around the country with whoever they could find who had worked on the mountain, on the construction and the carving of that mountain. The sculptor long since died, but there were some 300 people, mostly miners, who worked blasting the stone away and following his instructions to create that mountain carving. And and then they ended up writing a book about Mount Rushmore and the sculptor, running the museum there. So I spent a lot of time around those heads on the mountain. And, to think that I would, kind of grow up in the shadow of these presidents and then one day have the opportunity to not just meet presidents, but to ask them questions, including difficult questions, including, questions that are not just questions that I wanted answered, but questions that, that hundreds of millions of Americans may have and don't ever have the opportunity to ask. So I feel like I'm doing my work on behalf of a lot of people. It's not just me sitting in that briefing room. So along the way, luck has certainly played a role. And getting back to your theme of your podcast, I mean, how can you not feel grateful to walk into the White House and to have a chance to question the most powerful political figure in the country, maybe the world. Or, I spent a lot of my time covering Congress. No matter how many times I've walked into that building, I feel a sense of awe that I'm there, gratitude for being there. When my mom and stepfather were working on that project, we came to Washington and stayed in a boarding house for a couple of weeks while they did work at the Library of Congress. And I would always look up when we were anywhere within the vicinity of the Capitol to see, there's a light at the top of the dome that is on when the Congress is in session. And I would be like, I want to go. I want to see what's happening. So yeah, and my whole life in some ways is a question of luck.
It's interesting. I had the privilege to actually attend a session. I think it was late night in the galley, and walking the stairs, you kind of see from an angle the rotunda. And obviously, pictures weren't allowed back, cameras weren't allowed back then, but I still get that mental picture in my mind. It's like, how beautiful is this? Yeah. Curious, was there a particular event that you covered that made you become a better person?
I think in a way, this is going to sound, maybe it sounds like a cop-out, but I think that the whole story of what I've covered has hopefully helped me strive to become a better person. I think that maybe the most searing story, there have been a lot. I spent some time in Iraq and Afghanistan when I was covering national security for ABC. I did 4 trips to Sudan in the 2004-2005 time frame. This is when the genocide in Darfur really was underway, and you can't see that and talk to these people that are suffering so incomprehensibly and not have it affect your life and what you think. And again,
yeah, I guess it goes back to what you mentioned earlier. You're grateful of the things you have around you,
and you feel real responsibility when you're in a situation like that to tell those stories. It's like you're there through whatever fate has, to whatever has happened. You are there, and these are people whose stories are not being told. And frankly, it can be a little bit of a challenge. I had to fight. In a good way, but I had to really argue forcefully that that the network should expend the money and the resources and the time to send me over to cover a story in Western Sudan. When my job was actually at that point to cover the State Department, and then once I did it, to make the case, we have 22 minutes on world news for the entire news, all that's going on in the world, to say that a chunk of that should be devoted to the plight of these people half a world away. So you feel a real responsibility when you get the story, and then you really feel a responsibility to tell it effectively. By the way, the big advocate on that story, and the one who made sure that I got a chance to go over there and made sure that the story is aired, and actually it was Peter Jennings. And the last one of the last stories I did, from my travels over there, Peter, who died of lung cancer, was in the hospital and putting edits on my final stories for those Sudan stories, which was pretty amazing.
Wow, that is indeed very powerful. Final question to the citizens of Yoga Nation, I call them. Is there anything that I didn't ask that you would like to bring attention to these themes of gratitude, self-awareness, our inner spirit, and rebulling?
I think you've done a terrific job. We could probably talk for hours, many things to explore. But look, it's great to spend a little bit of time with you over the whatever we call this thing. It's not quite Zoom, but Zoom-like. And it's good to see you, and it was great to meet you in Tucson. And I'm sure our paths will cross again.
Well, Jonathan, it was a pleasure having you on the podcast, and look forward to hopefully having, as you mentioned, the chance to connect with you again.
All right. Best to you and best to your incredible daughter.
Appreciate it. Bye for now.
All right. Take care.